In a corner of the National Archives, tucked away in a mislabeled folder within the records of the Board of Trade, sits a single grainy photograph from the spring of 1879. The image depicts a landscape of mud and horse-drawn wagons, typical of the late Victorian era. But in the background, rising like a jagged needle against the gray horizon, is a structure that defies the architectural logic of its time. It is a tower, nearly 300 feet tall, constructed not of brick or masonry, but of a spindly, sophisticated lattice of high-tensile steel. At a time when the world was still marveling at the wrought iron of the Eiffel Tower's earliest designs, these structures, located in the remote corners of the British Isles and the American Appalachians, represented a leap in engineering that seemed to bypass decades of trial and error. They were known in local parlance as the Sentinel Towers. Yet by the winter of 1880, every single one of them had been dismantled, their materials sold for scrap, and their blueprints subjected to a government-ordered purge. To understand the mystery of the 1879 steel towers, one has to understand the terrifying fragility of the era. The late 1870s were defined by a series of catastrophic engineering failures. Most notable was the Tay Bridge disaster in December 1879, where a massive iron bridge collapsed during a storm, plunging a train into the icy waters below. The disaster sent a wave of paranoia through the halls of power. If a bridge designed by the most celebrated engineers of the day could fail so spectacularly, what else was at risk? Records suggest that the government's obsession with these towers wasn't born out of aesthetic concern, but out of a deep-seated fear of what they represented. These were not public works. They were private experiments, funded by a secretive consortium of telegraph magnates and steel industrialists who believed they could master the atmosphere itself. The first hint that these towers were more than just tall masts came from the diaries of Josiah Calloway, a junior engineer who worked on the construction of the tower near the Welsh coast. Calloway described a building process that seemed almost impossible for the era. The steel wasn't the standard Bessemer iron used in railroads. It was a refined nickel-steel alloy that, according to Calloway, rung like a bell when struck and seemed to draw the very heat from the air. But that wasn't the strangest part. Calloway noted that the towers weren't built with traditional rivets alone. They utilized a primitive form of thermal expansion fitting, a technique that predates modern precision engineering by nearly half a century. As the towers rose, so did the curiosity of the local populations. In the Ohio Valley, where two of the structures were erected over the summer of 1879, residents reported a strange phenomenon. During heavy thunderstorms, the towers didn't just stand as passive observers. They seemed to hum. A low, vibrating frequency would emanate from the steel lattice, a sound so pervasive it was said to cause headaches in livestock and spoil milk in the nearby dairies. The discovery of the tower's true purpose began when a local surveyor in West Virginia noticed that the towers were aligned with surgical precision across hundreds of miles of rugged terrain. They weren't positioned near cities or railway hubs. They were placed on specific magnetic anomalies points where the Earth's natural field was known to fluctuate. Some historians believe that the consortium was attempting to build a wireless telegraphy network decades before Guglielmo Marconi. The idea was to use the steel towers as massive resonators, vibrating the atmosphere to carry signals across the Atlantic without the need for expensive, fragile underwater cables. But this theory remains a subject of intense archival debate, as no record of a successful transmission has ever been found. And that's when things began to shift. In September 1879, just as the network was nearing completion, the British and American governments issued a joint emergency decree for the protection of public infrastructure. It was an unprecedented move. Overnight, the Sentinel Towers were declared hazards to the national defense. The official narrative was that the towers were structurally unsound, prone to the same metal fatigue that had claimed the Tay Bridge. But the speed and violence of the response suggest a different reality. Armed guards were stationed at the base of the towers, and the engineers, including Josiah Calloway, were suddenly dismissed, their contracts bought out with sums that exceeded their yearly salaries. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. When the demolition teams arrived, they didn't use sledgehammers and saws. They used specialized equipment to de-energize the structures before they could be unbolted. In his final diary entry, Calloway wrote of seeing shimmering arcs of blue light dancing across the steel as the first supports were removed. He claimed the towers weren't just standing in the wind, they were holding a charge. The development of the mystery took a more sinister turn when a journalist for the Cincinnati Enquirer attempted to interview the head of the consortium, a man named Sterling Vance. Vance was a reclusive figure who had made a fortune in the early days of the Bessemer process. When the journalist arrived at Vance's estate, he found it completely empty. Vance had vanished, along with every piece of paper related to the Sentinel project. What doesn't add up is the logistical cost of the destruction. It is estimated that the government spent more money tearing the towers down than the consortium had spent building them. In an era of strict fiscal conservatism, this level of expenditure on a structural hazard was unheard of. Some researchers suggest that the towers were accidentally tapping into something they couldn't control. They weren't just radio towers, they were unintentional lightning rods of a scale the world had never seen. There are unconfirmed reports from October 1879 of atmospheric fires in the vicinity of the tower's columns of plasma that descended from the clouds and bathed the steel in a terrifying silent light. There is no clear consensus on whether these events were real or the result of local superstition heightened by the tower's eerie appearance. However, the government's response was very real. The sites where the towers stood were not just cleared, they were sanitized. The foundations were dug up, the soil was turned, and in many cases the land was purchased by the state and designated as restricted territory for the next 50 years. The layers of evidence suggest that the 1,879 steel towers were the victim of a technological bottleneck. The world was ready for steel, but it wasn't ready for the forces that steel could unlock. The structures predated the mathematics of structural resonance and the understanding of electromagnetic interference. They were giants, born into an age of midgets. But as we peel back the history of these structures, a personal story emerges from the archives. A letter from a woman named Clara Vance, the sister of the missing industrialist. In 1881, she wrote to a friend, "Sterling did not build for the present. He built to catch the voice of the world. They tore it down because they were afraid of what the voice was saying." What happened next remains unclear. The records of the demolition were moved to a secure facility during the First World War, and many are believed to have been lost during the Blitz. But the locations of the towers, the Sentinel sites, remain a point of interest for modern geophysicists. Even today, over a century after the steel was removed, these sites show a peculiar lack of vegetation and a measurable disturbance in the local magnetic field. And that's when things began to shift. Clara Vance's reference to the voice of the world has often been dismissed by historians as the poetic rambling of a grieving relative. But in the context of late 19th century physics, the phrase takes on a far more technical and perhaps more terrifying meaning. In 1879, the scientific community was gripped by the theory of the luminiferous ether, an invisible, all-pervading medium that was thought to carry light and electromagnetic waves. Sterling Vance and his consortium didn't believe the ether was a passive void. They believed it was a reservoir of energy that could be tapped if one had a large enough antenna. The Sentinel towers were that antenna. But as the network grew, The voice they were catching began to manifest in ways that threatened the very stability of Victorian society. In October 1879, a strange phenomenon was recorded by telegraph operators across the North Atlantic. It became known in the industry as the October murmur. For 3 consecutive nights, the global telegraph network, the Victorian Internet, began to act of its own accord. Even with the batteries disconnected, the needles on the receivers danced wildly, scratching out rhythmic, repetitive patterns that bore no resemblance to Morse code. At first, it was blamed on sunspots. But as the Admiralty's Secret Signals Department began to map the intensity of the interference, they realized the murmur was strongest in the immediate vicinity of the Sentinel Towers. The towers weren't just standing, they were vibrating in sympathy with an atmospheric frequency that shouldn't have existed. But that wasn't the strangest part of the October murmur. When the rhythmic taps were transcribed, they didn't follow a linear progression. They appeared to be echoes. Operators reported hearing their own messages played back to them seconds after they were sent, but with a strange, metallic distortion. It was as if the aether itself was acting as a recording medium, and the towers were the needle. This led to a frantic high-level meeting in London between the representatives of the British Crown and the US State Department. The fear wasn't just about technical interference. It was about a total loss of privacy and control. If a private individual like Sterling Vance could build a system that intercepted and echoed the most sensitive, diplomatic, and financial communications of the 2 greatest powers on Earth, the traditional structures of government would collapse. Records suggest that the 1879 emergency decree was drafted in a single night of panic. The official excuse of structural instability was a convenient mask for a much larger operation: the containment of a technological breakthrough that the world wasn't ready to handle. The government didn't just want to stop the towers, they wanted to erase the very possibility of their existence. And that's when things began to shift. As the demolition crews moved in, they discovered that the towers were undergoing a physical transformation. The nickel-steel alloy, once bright and reflective, had turned a deep, iridescent blue. Metallurgists of the time had no explanation for this. Some modern researchers believe the steel was being subjected to a constant, high-frequency stressing from atmospheric electricity, effectively changing the molecular structure of the metal. What doesn't add up is the fate of the materials. After the towers were unbolted, the steel was loaded onto specialized rail cars under heavy guard. Official manifests state the metal was taken to the foundries of the North to be melted down. But a researcher in the 1980s, tracking the serial numbers of the specialized rail cars used in the Ohio Valley, found that they never arrived at their destination. Instead, the cars were diverted to a coastal military depot and loaded onto a barge that was subsequently lost at sea during a routine transport. This has led to the sunk asset theory. Some historians believe the government didn't melt the steel because they didn't know how to neutralize it. If the metal had indeed been altered by its time in the Sentinel Towers, perhaps the authorities feared that even in a new form as a bridge or a hull, it would continue to act as a resonator for the murmur. The ocean was the only place deep enough to silence it. The development of the aftermath took an even stranger turn when the 1880 Royal Commission inquiry was convened. The transcripts were immediately classified. However, a leaked summary, discovered in the attic of a former clerk in the 1950s, describes the testimony of a Dr. Aristos, a physicist who had consulted for the Vance Consortium. Aristos claimed that the towers hadn't just been receiving signals, they had been thinning the veil. He described a state of localized atmospheric collapse, where the air around the towers would become unnaturally cold, even in the height of summer, and where the sky would take on a violet hue that was visible for miles. He warned the Commission that the towers were tethering the Earth to a source of energy that was non-centripetal, a term that has no modern equivalent in physics, but which suggests a force that didn't follow the standard laws of gravity and motion. The Commission's response was a total blackout. Not only were the towers destroyed, but every patent filed by Sterling Vance between 1875 and 1880 was struck from the records of the Patent Office. It was a damnatio memoriae, an official erasing of a man's legacy. Vance himself was never seen again. Some believe he was imprisoned. Others suggest he fled to South America, taking his most sensitive calculations with him. But what Clara Vance wrote in 1881, that Sterling was catching the voice of the world, took on a new layer of evidence in the modern age. In the late 1990s, an amateur radio enthusiast in West Virginia, using a highly sensitive VLF, very low frequency, receiver near one of the original Sentinel sites, picked up a strange signal. It wasn't a modern broadcast. It was a rhythmic, pulsing hum that, when analyzed, matched the October murmur patterns described in the 1879 telegraph logs. How could a signal from 1879 still be echoing a century later? There is no clear consensus. Some believe the Sentinel towers created a standing wave in the Earth's ionosphere, a loop of energy that continues to circle the globe, getting weaker with every decade but never quite disappearing. Others suggest the towers didn't create the signal but simply made it audible, and what we are hearing is a natural, albeit rare, planetary resonance. The turning point for modern investigators came with the declassification of certain site survey maps from the Cold War era. These maps, intended for the placement of early warning radar, showed several permanent interference zones that correlated exactly with the locations of the 1879 steel towers. The military had been aware of these dead zones for decades, marking them as areas where radio and radar would behave unpredictably. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. Using LiDAR to scan the Earth at the Ohio Sentinel site, researchers found that the foundations hadn't just been dug up, as the records claimed. They had been encased in a massive, lead-lined concrete sarcophagus, buried 60 feet below the surface. This wasn't a standard demolition. This was a burial. And it raises the most unsettling question of all. If the towers were just unstable steel, why treat them like a nuclear hazard 60 years before the invention of the atomic bomb? The lead-line burial of the Sentinel foundations suggests a level of precaution that borders on the ritualistic. In the 1870s, the shielding properties of lead were well understood in the context of X-rays, which hadn't been discovered yet, or radioactivity, but they were also used to contain highly corrosive chemical byproducts or to provide a perfect ground for sensitive electrical experiments. If the government felt the need to encase these sites in lead and concrete, they were likely trying to insulate the Earth from the tower's legacy, or perhaps to insulate the tower's remnants from the Earth. This isolation protocol provides a possible answer to why the project was so thoroughly erased. If the towers had successfully tapped into a source of atmospheric electricity, they may have created a hotspot that couldn't be turned off simply by removing the steel. The lead was a damper, a way to mute a resonance that had become a permanent part of the local geography. But the most haunting evidence of the tower's effect wasn't found in the soil or the steel, but in the people who lived near them. In the mid-20th century, a medical historian named Dr. Elena Rossi began investigating a cluster of neurological anomalies in the regions where the towers had once stood. She found that for 2 generations following 1879, the local populations reported a significantly higher incidence of synesthesia, a condition where senses become merged, allowing people to see sounds or taste colors. Records suggest that many of the residents in these Ohio and Welsh valleys claimed they could see the hum of the earth long after the towers were gone. While some historians believe this was a form of mass psychogenic illness sparked by the strange events of 1879, Others suggest that the tower's high-frequency vibrations had a subtle, long-term effect on the human nervous system. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. In 2014, a digital scan of a private collection of Victorian spirit photographs revealed something that had been hidden in plain sight. Spirit photography was a popular fad in the late 1800s, often involving double exposures to create ghosts. But in a series of photos taken near the West Virginia Sentinel site in late 1879, there are no ghosts. Instead, there are clear, geometric distortions in the background, vertical shimmer lines that look remarkably like the interference patterns seen on modern digital cameras when they are near high-voltage power lines. These photos were taken by an amateur who had no connection to the Vance Consortium. They represent an unintentional, objective record of the atmospheric thinning that Dr. Aristos had described to the Royal Commission. The air itself was being physically altered, becoming a lens that distorted the light. The turning point for the story of Sterling Vance and his steel towers came with the realization that the 1879 experiment wasn't just a British or American phenomenon. Fragmentary records from the French Ministry of Public Works and the Russian Imperial Academy of Sciences suggest that similar tall lattice experiments were being conducted simultaneously across the globe. It appears there was a quiet, international race to claim the etheric high ground, a race that ended as abruptly as it began. What doesn't add up is the global coordination of the shutdown. Why did every nation, regardless of their geopolitical tensions, decide to dismantle their towers in the same 18-month window? There is no clear consensus, but some historians believe that the October murmur wasn't just an echo of telegraphs. They suspect it was a signal of a massive, impending etheric storm, a geophysical event that the towers were accidentally amplifying and which threatened to set the atmosphere itself on fire. By 1881, the silence was absolute. The steel was gone. The patents were erased, and Sterling Vance had become a ghost in the machinery of history. The Sentinel Towers were relegated to the status of an urban legend, a folly of a mad industrialist. But the strategic reality of hidden logistics and infrastructure tells us that nothing on that scale is ever truly a folly. It is always a precursor. The aftermath of the Sentinel project can be seen in the way we developed radio and telecommunications in the 20th century. We moved away from the resonant lattice approach of Vance, opting instead for the localized low-power transmissions of the Marconi era. We chose a safer, more controllable path. The Sentinel Towers were a road not taken, a vision of a world powered by the very air we breathe, which was discarded because it was too powerful to be owned and too volatile to be governed. In recent years, the Sentinel sites have become a focal point for a new generation of scientists interested in telluric currents, natural electric currents that flow through the Earth's crust. Using modern quantum sensors, they have found that the sites of the 1879 towers still exhibit a pulse. It is a rhythmic, low-frequency signal that matches the descriptions of the murmur perfectly. It suggests that the towers didn't create the sound, they were simply the first instruments capable of playing it. As we stand on the cusp of new breakthroughs in wireless energy and atmospheric physics, the story of the 1879 steel towers serves as a chilling reminder of the cost of premature discovery. We often think of history as a steady climb toward greater understanding, but the Sentinel Towers suggest a more complex reality, a history of leaps into the dark, followed by panicked retreats into the light. The towers are gone, and the lead-lined sarcophagi remain buried beneath our feet, hidden by a century of topsoil and indifference. But the voice of the world that Sterling Vance tried to catch is still there, vibrating in the atmosphere and humming in the bedrock. What happened next remains unclear, as we continue to build our modern world on top of the silent ruins of a more ambitious past. The mystery of the 1,879 steel towers remains one of the great what-ifs of the industrial age. They were a bridge to a future that was burned before we could cross it. And as the modern world becomes increasingly saturated with its own electronic murmurs, we may find that the Sentinel Towers were not a failure of engineering, but a failure of timing. The air remains quiet, for now. But at the old sites, when the wind is right and the clouds are heavy with the charge of a coming storm, some say you can still hear the hum, the ghost of a steel lattice that dared to touch the sky and was brought down by the very world it tried to connect. The secrets of the 1,879 towers remain locked in the lead and the silt 3 generations deep. Whether they were a hazard to be destroyed or a gift we were too fearful to keep is a question that only the future, and perhaps the return of the murmur, can answer.